And serve the Lord with really great distinction. Each one of them is a great story. We may study a couple of them later. But he had no lack of education as he grew up in pre-World War II China. In fact, he said the family home had over 5,000 books. He took his education first of all at home, and then when he came into high school, he continued at the Shanghai American High School, which was a school developed by missionaries, some Chinese businessmen, to train missionary children there in China. After he graduated in, I believe, in 1928, he left China and went back for the first time to the United States. The first time he would remember. Of course, he was born here, but first time to go back to the United States. He went to college at Colgate University, graduated in 1932, and then he returned to China. Not really knowing what the Lord would have him do. He didn't know if he should go into full-time service. There were job opportunities there. It's hard to describe, or hard to even maybe imagine what China was like before World War II. It was really a thriving place, real possibilities, democratic elected government, just very different China than it is today. And he went back and wasn't sure, again, if he should work in the church there, be a medical missionary. He had some training there in medicine, or to teach. He took a job with an oil company and then taught part-time at the Shanghai American High School where he had gone to school. It was there that he met a lady, Elizabeth McCrae. They were married, and they settled down into married life. This was 1932, 1933. All that tranquil new married life was interrupted when the Japanese invaded China on August 13, 1937. And these are the opening volleys of what would be World War II. And this is kind of an area in history that to me is maybe overshadowed by what would come next. But this is a terrible time for the Chinese as the Japanese invaded and occupied China. Just a terrible, terrible time. It's very interesting to read if you're interested what the Chinese went through and how wicked the Japanese armies were to the Chinese people during that time. Stephen returned to America with his wife as the tensions were growing between even the United States and Japan, of course. This is 1937. As soon as they got back, though, he felt the Lord calling him back to China to be in the Lord's work and to be in missions. So he went back to China in 1939 and began to work in the local church there. He was establishing churches, Bible studies, establishing even schools, built a few schools, and began to work in the ministry there. The Goddards had a son. That's important for what will happen here in just a moment, but the Goddards had a son. And then as the tensions grew greater between Japan, who was kind of occupying China at that time, Goddard sent his wife and young son back to America, and he stayed. He wrote his parents during that time, during that very difficult time, and he said this, and I think it's interesting to read it. He said, "I have heard no voice, and I have seen no vision, but I have a definite conviction that unless Christ and his principles are followed throughout the world, there will even be more chaos than at present, and my sense of duty as a Christian gives me a strong desire to have a part in this redemptive work. If I consulted nothing but my own personal feelings, would I not take the next boat or plane to the United States?" And of course, remember, he sent his wife and child back to the United States. He was really wanted to be with them, but that was not to be the case. He had planned to go back in 1942, but of course, on December 7th, on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese invaded or bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States and Japan are at war. Now he's living in a country that is occupied by the Japanese army that is at war with the United States, and now he's on the run. And so this is 1942. This would be December of 1941. And this story, I would love to take a couple weeks and tell this story, but I won't. But what he did then was he had to flee because he was considered a fugitive from the Japanese army. He had to flee from the Japanese army. And the story then takes place where he took every conveyance possible, trains, rickshaws, boats, everything he could to escape the to escape the Japanese as he fled further west into China, where he thought it might be safer. Of course, China is a huge continent, a huge area, and this took a long time. He slept in freezing cold weather. He slept in very, very hot weather. Slept in the mountains. Slept in the forest. He fled there. But every place he went, he was able then to teach the gospel as he went through those areas, and he left quite a legacy of hundreds of places that he stopped and left tracks or preached for a week. Just really an amazing situation. And he didn't feel sorry for himself. He just felt the Lord was taking him through that to be able to minister to these people that he never would have had a chance to minister to. Ultimately, he ran into some Americans. He was flown by DC-3 over the mountains into India, and there he boarded a Liberty ship, as it was called. But then it wasn't over, because then for the next 62 days, that ship zigzagged from port to port across the ocean of trying to avoid Japanese and German U-boats who were sinking everything they could see on the seas. You can imagine the thrill of the people on that ship as they sailed and anchored just next to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor on November 2nd, 1943. Now, get those dates. He was running from December of 41 until November of 43, 2 years. Imagine that. His wife and family not knowing where he was, not knowing if he was alive or dead, and he had no contact with them, of course. So this man, a teacher, a businessman, a missionary, he, of course, was in the United States, but went back to China after the war was over in 1946 and continued the work that the 4 generations of Goddards had been doing in China. It is said that the 5 men of these four generations and their families invested well over 400 years of their lives in order that the Chinese might know the grace of God. And just an amazing story of the Goddards and their service there in China. I want to thank the Lord this morning for this man who most of us don't even know that name, but imagine that life and what he went through to serve the Lord and to reach those Chinese people. And I want to thank the Lord for Stephen Goddard this morning.